Welcome to English Story Cafe. Today we will explore Henry Ford's life story. When you look out the window today, what do you see? You probably see paved roads. You see cars parked in driveways. You see trucks delivering goods to supermarkets. You might see a gas station on the corner. It is a world on wheels. It is easy to think that the world has always looked like this, but it has not. A little over 100 years ago, the world was quiet. It was the world of the horse and the carriage. The roads were made of dirt and mud. Traveling just 20 miles was a full-day journey. The idea of a machine that could move itself, a distinct metal beast breathing fire and smoke, seemed like magic or madness to most people. But there was one man who saw the future clearly. He did not just see a car, he saw a changed world. His name was Henry Ford, and his story is not just about metal and engines. It is a story about failure, about stubbornness, and about the power of a simple idea. Our story begins in the summer of 1863. America was in the middle of a terrible civil war. But on a small farm in Michigan, a baby boy was born. Henry grew up in a world of physical labor. His father, William, was a farmer. He expected Henry to be a farmer too. In those days, farming was brutal work. You woke up before the sun, you worked until your muscles burned, you slept, and you did it again. But young Henry was different. While other boys played with balls or sticks, Henry played with tools. He was fascinated by how things worked. He did not look at a machine and see a magical object. He saw a puzzle. He wanted to know what happened inside. There's a famous story about Henry when he was a teenager. He became obsessed with watches. A pocket watch is a tiny, delicate universe of gears and springs. If you move one piece, the whole thing stops. Henry gathered tools, needles, tiny screwdrivers, anything he could find. He would sit at a table by candlelight, his eyes focused on the tiny mechanisms. He fixed the watches of his neighbors. He fixed the watches of his friends. He took them apart and put them back together just to see if he could do it faster. He was learning a language, not of words, but of mechanics. He was learning logic. If A moves, then B must move. This logical thinking would define his entire life. But the farm could not hold him. Henry hated farming. He famously said later in life, "I never had any particular love for the farm. It was the mother that I loved." When his mother passed away in 1876, the farm felt empty. At the age of 16, he did something brave. He left. He walked away from the destiny his father had planned for him. He walked all the way to Detroit. Detroit in the late 19th century was a bustling city of industry. It was noisy, dirty, and exciting. Henry found work in machine shops. He was like a sponge, absorbing everything he could about steam engines and the new mysterious internal combustion engines. He worked long hours, often for very little money. But he was not working for the paycheck. He was working for the knowledge. He returned to the farm briefly when he got married to a woman named Clara Bryant, who would become his greatest supporter, but his heart remained in the machine shop. By 1891, Henry was back in Detroit working as an engineer for the Edison Illuminating Company. Yes, that Edison, Thomas Edison, the great inventor of the light bulb. Henry rose quickly through the ranks to become chief engineer. This job gave him enough money and, more importantly, enough time to pursue his real passion. Every night, after working a full day at the power plant, Henry would go home to a small shed behind his house. Imagine the scene. It is 2 in the morning. The neighbors are asleep. The streets are dark. But in a small brick shed, a light is flickering. Inside, the air smells of gasoline and oil. Henry Ford is there, his hands covered in grease, working on a strange creation. He called it the quadricycle. It did not look like a Ferrari. It looked like 2 bicycles smashed together with a wooden frame and a small engine. It had no steering wheel, only a tiller like a boat. It had no brakes. It had no reverse gear. On a rainy night in 1896, it was finally finished. Henry was ready to test it. But he realized a terrible mistake. He had built the car inside the shed, but the car was wider than the door. He had been so focused on the engine that he forgot about the exit. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed an axe and smashed down the brick wall of the shed. He rolled the quadricycle out into the wet street. His friend rode a bicycle ahead of him to warn pedestrians. Henry started the engine. It coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. He drove it down the street. It was slow, it was loud, and it was bumpy. But it moved. It was the first moment of a revolution.
However, having an invention is not the same as having a business. This is where the story gets difficult. We often think of successful people as having a straight path to the top. But Henry Ford was a failure before he was a success. He founded the Detroit Automobile Company in 1899. He had investors, he had a factory. But Henry was a perfectionist. He kept tinkering with the cars, trying to make them better instead of selling them. The cars were too expensive, and they were not reliable. The company failed. It went bankrupt. Henry did not give up. He tried again. He formed the Henry Ford Company. But again, he argued with his investors. They wanted to build expensive cars for rich people. Henry wanted to build cars for everyone. The conflict was too great. Henry left the company. That company he left? It was reorganized and became Cadillac, one of the most successful luxury car brands in history. So Henry Ford essentially walked away from a gold mine because it was not the gold mine he wanted. By now, Henry was 40 years old. In the early 1900s, 40 was considered middle-aged. Most men were settled. Henry was broke. He had a reputation as a difficult man who could not finish a project. The banks did not trust him. The investors ignored him. He had one last chance. He knew he had to do something dramatic to get attention. He had to prove his car was the best. He built a race car. He called it the 999. It was a beast. It was essentially a massive engine on wheels with no safety features. It produced 80 horsepower, which at the time was terrifying. He hired a famous bicycle racer named Barney Oldfield to drive it. The race was set. The crowd gathered. The 999 roared so loudly that people covered their ears. It won the race by a huge margin. It was faster than anything anyone had seen. The victory made headlines. Ford car breaks record. Suddenly, the money came back. In 1903, the Ford Motor Company was incorporated. This time, Henry was in control. He began producing cars, naming them after letters of the alphabet. There was the Model A, the Model B, the Model C. Some were good, some were bad. But Henry was searching for something specific. He was searching for the perfect car. A car that was light, strong, and simple. A car that a farmer could fix with a hammer and a wrench. In 1908, he found it: the Model T. When the Model T was released, it changed human history. It was ugly to some people. It was boxy and sat high off the ground. But it was tough. It was made of vanadium steel, an alloy that was 3 times stronger than normal steel. It could handle the muddy, bumpy roads of America, and best of all, it was affordable. At first, it cost $850. That was still a lot of money, but it was half the price of other cars. Suddenly, doctors, teachers, and farmers could dream of owning a car. The demand was insane. People mailed checks to the factory before the cars were even built. Henry Ford had a problem. He could not build them fast enough. In the traditional way of making cars, a group of mechanics stood around a chassis and built the car piece by piece. It took about 12 hours to build one single car. Henry knew this was too slow. He looked at other industries. He looked at flour mills. He looked at meat packing plants in Chicago, where carcasses moved on a line and butchers cut off pieces as they passed. He thought, why not reverse the process? Instead of the men moving to the car, why not make the car move to the men? In 1913, Henry Ford introduced the moving assembly line. He installed a conveyor belt in his factory. He broke the job of building a car into thousands of tiny steps. One man put on a wheel. The next man tightened the bolt. The next man put on the tire. The car moved constantly. The workers stood still. The result was a miracle of efficiency. The time to build a Model T dropped from 12 hours to just 90 minutes. Because he could build them faster, he could sell them cheaper. The price dropped to $500, then $300. Henry Ford was flooding the world with cars. He famously said, "Any customer can have a car painted any color that he wants, so long as it is black." The reason? Black paint dried the fastest. But Henry Ford had one more shock for the world. The assembly line work was boring. It was repetitive. Men hated it. They quit by the thousands. The turnover rate was terrible. Henry needed to keep his workers. In 1914, he made an announcement that shook the foundations of capitalism. At that time, the average factory worker made about $2.30 a day. Henry Ford announced he would pay his workers $5 a day.
The business world thought he was crazy. The Wall Street Journal criticized him. Other factory owners said he would ruin the economy. They said he was a socialist. But Henry Ford was a capitalist genius. He realized something that no one else had seen. If he paid his workers enough money, they would not just be workers, they would be customers. With $5 a day, a Ford worker could save up and buy a Ford Model T. He was creating his own market. Thousands of men lined up outside the Ford factory, desperate for a job. He got the best mechanics, the best workers, and they stayed. The Ford Motor Company became a powerhouse. The Model T became the symbol of America. It gave people freedom. You could live in the country and work in the city. You could visit relatives in another state. The world became smaller and life became bigger. However, the story of Henry Ford is not a fairy tale. As he grew older, the very stubbornness that made him successful began to hurt him. He believed the Model T was the perfect car and that it never needed to change. For nearly 20 years, he refused to update it. Meanwhile, other companies like Chevrolet and General Motors were designing modern, comfortable, stylish cars. They offered different colors. They offered electric starters, so you did not have to hand crank the engine. Ford's sales began to drop. His son, Edsel Ford, pleaded with him to design a new car. Henry got angry. He actually tore a prototype of a new car apart with his bare hands because he felt betrayed. He was a man frozen in time, unable to see that the future he created was now moving past him. It took years of declining sales before he finally admitted defeat.
In 1927, he stopped production of the Model T. He shut down the factory for months to retool for a new car, the new Model A. It was a success, but Ford Motor Company never quite regained the total dominance it once had. Henry Ford's later years were complicated. He was a pacifist who hated war, yet his factories built bombers and jeeps for World War II. He was a man who hired African Americans and paid them equal wages when no one else would. Yet he also owned a newspaper that published terrible anti-Semitic articles, staining his reputation forever. He was a genius, but he was also a flawed human being. He passed away in 1947 at the age of 83. So why do we tell this story in an English learning podcast? What does a car mechanic from the 1800s have to do with you learning grammar and vocabulary today? Think about the assembly line. Henry Ford did not build a car in one giant leap. He broke it down, bolt by bolt, wire by wire, step by step. Learning a language is exactly the same. You cannot wake up one morning and simply know English. That is like trying to build a car in 5 minutes. It is impossible, and it will only make you frustrated. Instead, you must build your English like a Model T. Today, you learn one idiom. That is one bolt. Tomorrow, you practice the past tense. That is one wheel. The next day, you listen to a podcast. That is the engine. It might feel slow. It might feel repetitive, just like the factory line. You might feel like you are doing the same thing over and over again. But remember the result. Small, consistent actions, repeated over time, create something magnificent. Henry Ford also teaches us about failure. Remember, his first 2 car companies went bankrupt. He was 40 years old and considered a failure by society before he found success. If you try to speak English and you make a mistake, if you use the wrong word and someone laughs, or if you take a test and get a low score, think of Henry Ford. He did not stop. He did not say, "Well, I guess I'm not a car maker." He said, "I can do it better." Every mistake you make is just a prototype that didn't work. It is data. It tells you what to fix for the next time. When you struggle to understand a movie or when you cannot find the right word in a conversation, do not see it as a lack of talent. See it as a necessary step in the engineering of your fluency. Henry Ford's greatest invention was not the car. It was the idea that mobility belongs to everyone. He democratized travel. In the same way, English belongs to everyone. It does not belong to England or America. It is a tool, a vehicle that you can drive to a new career, a new friendship, or a new understanding of the world. It is the key to the modern highway of information. As you go about your day today, look at the cars passing by. Listen to the hum of the engines. Let them remind you of the boy who fixed watches by candlelight. Let them remind you that the road to success is paved with failures, hard work, and the courage to try something new. You are the engineer of your own life. You are the driver of your own journey. Keep building, keep driving, and never let a breakdown stop you from reaching your destination. Thank you for listening to English Story Cafe. I hope the story of Henry Ford fuels your motivation this week. Until next time, keep learning, keep listening, and keep moving forward.